There's a moment I keep coming back to, and I've turned it over in my head so many times that the edges have gone soft, like a stone you've been carrying in your pocket for years. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October, the kind of day in Nova Scotia where the sky can't decide between rain and just threatening it, and I was standing in the middle of a parking garage in downtown Halifax in my work clothes. Paint-spattered Carhartt jacket, steel-toed boots with the left toe peeling back at the seam, and a woman I'd never met in my life was looking at me the way people look at a mechanic who's just told them the repair will cost more than the car. Except I wasn't the mechanic in this story. I was the guy she hadn't called yet, and I was about to change everything. But I need to back up, because the story doesn't start in that parking garage. It starts with a boat. My name is Ray Kowalski. I'm 41 years old. I'm a marine carpenter. I repair and restore wooden boats, mostly older ones, the kind that wealthy summer people bring up to the South Shore and then ignore for 11 months of the year until something rots through and they panic. I run a small shop out of Lunenburg, about an hour southwest of Halifax. It's me, a part-time helper named Adrian, who's 19 and still learning which end of a chisel to hold, and my daughter Molly, who is 8 and has strong opinions about everything, including which sandpaper grit is appropriate for which application. She's been coming to the shop with me since she was 4. Her mother left when Molly was 2. That's a longer story, and it's not this one. What you need to know is that it's just the two of us. It has been for 6 years. We live in a house that needs more work than I have time to give it. We drive a 2009 Ford F-150 that I've kept running through a combination of skill and stubbornness, and most months we are fine. Not comfortable. Fine. There's a difference, and anyone who's raised a kid alone on a tradesman's income knows exactly what I mean by that. The boat that starts this story belonged to a man named Howard Callister. Howard passed away in the spring. Heart attack, sudden, 73 years old. And his family contacted me in August because they'd found my name on a card tucked inside the hull of Howard's boat, a 1962 Shepherd mahogany runabout that had been sitting under a tarp in a building on his property outside Chester for somewhere between 8 and 12 years. Howard had brought the boat to me back in 2019 for some planking work on the starboard side, and apparently he'd kept my card. Apparently he'd told his daughter about me, specifically, because the family was trying to figure out what to do with the boat, and the daughter remembered his exact words. If anything ever happens to me, call the Lunenburg guy. He'll know what it needs. I drove out to Chester on a Saturday in September. Molly came with me, sitting in the passenger seat eating a granola bar and asking me questions about wood rot with the focused curiosity of a child who spent too much time in a workshop. The boat was under a canvas tarp in a long, low building that had once been a carriage house. When I pulled the tarp back, I stood there for a moment and just looked. Mahogany runabouts from that era are something else. The lines on them, the way the planks curve. It's craftsmanship in a way that doesn't exist much anymore, not at that level, not done by hand the way those old builders did it. This one had been a beauty once. Still was, underneath the years. The varnish had gone gray and lifting in places. There was some checking on the transom, and I could see without even touching it that she'd need recalking along the waterline. But the bones were good. I could feel it. I met the daughter the following week, in Halifax, because that's where she lived. Her name was Simone Callister. She was 46, maybe 47. She had her father's coloring, dark eyes, dark hair with some gray coming in that she wasn't trying to hide, and she shook my hand the way people do when they're used to shaking a lot of hands and have learned to mean it. I noticed her watch before I noticed anything else, the way I always notice things that seem slightly out of place, because my brain is wired for incongruence. The watch was a Patek Philippe. I know what those cost because a client left one on the seat of his boat once and spent 45 minutes not breathing until I found it. We had coffee in a place on Barrington Street. She told me about her father, how he'd bought the boat in 1987, the year she was born, had spent 2 summers restoring it himself before he really knew what he was doing, had run it on the Mahone Bay every summer until his knees went bad, and then his wife got sick, and then the boat just stopped being a priority. She said the words like she was reading them off a list, factual and orderly, and then she stopped mid-sentence and looked out the window and said, "He used to take me out in it every Sunday morning in August. Just us. He'd bring thermoses of coffee and for me hot chocolate, and he'd let me steer if the water was flat enough. I was maybe 6 the first time. I remember the sound of it. I waited. She cleared her throat. Anyway, can it be restored? Properly. I told her it could. I told her what it would take and approximately what it would cost, which was significant but not unreasonable for what needed doing. She didn't flinch at the number. She said she'd think about it and let me know. She called me 3 days later, not to commission the work. Not yet. She called because she'd found something in her father's things, going through the last boxes from the estate, and she wasn't sure what to make of it. She'd found a notebook, one of those old green Hilroy notebooks, the kind we all had in school, and her father had apparently been keeping notes about the boat. Measurements, materials, a list of what he'd planned to do with it if he ever got back to it. And on the last written page, he'd made a list of questions he wanted to ask the Lunenburg guy. My name was at the top of the page, Ray Kowalski, Lunenburg, with my phone number, which hadn't changed. She read me the questions over the phone. They were good questions, technical, specific, the questions of someone who had once known this boat well and was trying to remember. I answered each one, and she wrote down my answers, and at the end she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "He would have liked talking to you." I said I thought I would have liked talking to him too, and I meant it. That was October. The work was commissioned. The boat came to my shop, and I had been into it for about 3 weeks when Simone called me again. This time her voice was different, not distressed, exactly, but tighter. She said she needed a favor, and she said it the way someone says something when they're not used to asking for favors, when the word itself sits awkward in their mouth. I said, "Sure." "What kind of favor?" She said there was a situation. She said she had a meeting the following Tuesday in Halifax with a group of people who were supposed to be experts, and that it concerned another one of her father's possessions, and that she had a feeling, she called it a feeling, specifically, that something wasn't right. She said she couldn't explain why she felt that, only that she'd learned to trust that feeling over the years, and that it had never steered her wrong yet. I asked what the possession was. She told me. It was a 1971 Chris-Craft Commander, a wooden cabin cruiser 38 feet, that Howard Callister had owned since 1994. He had kept it in a covered slip at a marina outside Dartmouth for the last decade, and after his death, the marina had been in touch with the estate, and the boat had been assessed by 3 separate marine surveyors, all of them with lengthy credentials and professional association memberships and websites, with lots of photographs of themselves standing on boats in sunglasses. And all 3 had concluded, independently, that the boat could not be restored to operational condition. The engine was seized. The electrical systems were corroded beyond viability. The hull had delamination issues and structural compromise along the keel. The cost to restore, all 3 had agreed, would exceed the value of the vessel by a significant margin. They recommended salvage. Simone had accepted this. She had signed the paperwork to proceed with salvage, and then 3 nights before the salvage company was scheduled to come and take the boat, she'd gone to the marina alone, after hours, the way her father used to do. She had his key card, and she'd sat in the boat in the dark for 2 hours just to say goodbye to it. And while she was sitting there, she heard something. She said she heard the sound of water moving through a boat that wasn't moving. She said she knew what that sound meant because her father had taught her what it meant, and it didn't mean what the surveyors said it meant. She asked me if I would come and look at it, before Tuesday, before the salvage company. I said yes. Obviously, I said yes. I went on a Sunday. Molly was with my neighbor Sandra that morning, which was an arrangement that had saved my life more times than I could count. Sandra is 68, and retired and has the patience of granite, and Molly adores her. I drove to the marina outside Dartmouth, which was one of those high-end operations, with a locked gate and a code panel, and cedar plank docking, and a building at the end of the main dock that looked more like a hotel lobby than a marina office. Simone met me at the gate. She was wearing a canvas jacket and rubber boots and no watch. She led me down to the slip without saying much. The commander was under a winter cover, a blue tarp stiff with fall damp, and we pulled it back section by section until the boat was exposed. I stood on the dock and looked at it for a while before I stepped aboard. You always look first. You don't touch until you've looked. Because your eyes will tell you things your hands will miss. She was rough. I won't pretend she wasn't. The varnish was a memory. The brightwork had gone green with oxidation. There was visible checking on the cabin sides, and the foredeck seam had opened up in 2 places. An inexperienced eye, even a credentialed inexperienced eye, could look at a boat in that condition and see only what was wrong. I stepped aboard carefully, testing the deck with my weight as I went. I went to the engine first, because the engine was what the surveyors had most agreed on. Seized, unrestorable, value in scrap only. I lifted the hatch. I looked at it for a long time. I put my hand on the block. Simone was standing in the cockpit watching me, and I could feel her watching me, and I want to say right now that she didn't say anything while I was working. She understood, without being told, that you don't talk while someone is listening with their hands. That's rarer than you'd think. I spent about 2 hours on that boat. I went through the bilge, I checked the keel fastenings, I went through the electrical panel with a meter I'd brought in my bag. I got under the forward berth and looked at the hull planking from the inside with a flashlight between my teeth. When I came back up to the cockpit, I sat down on the engine box cover, and Simone sat across from me, and I told her what I'd found. The engine wasn't seized. It had a hydrolocked cylinder. Water had got in past a valve cover gasket that had failed, and when someone had tried to crank it, probably the surveyor doing his assessment, the engine couldn't turn over because you can't compress water, and they'd concluded from that the engine was seized solid, which is an easy mistake to make if you're not looking for it. If you are looking for it, there's a specific way the engine resists that's different from a true seizure, and if you know what you're feeling for, you can tell the difference with your hand. The delamination in the hull wasn't structural compromise. It was a specific kind of moisture intrusion in one section of the keel deadwood, localized and addressable, not the systemic failure the surveyors had described. The electrical system was corroded, yes, but the wiring roots were intact, the panel was the original and rebuildable, and the corrosion was surface, not penetrating. This boat could be saved. Simone sat across from me in the cockpit, and I watched her process what I was telling her. She was still for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "My father knew." I didn't understand what she meant. She said that her father had been meticulous about this boat, that he'd kept records. He kept records about everything, and that in his records for the commander, going back 30 years, he had noted every repair, every part replacement, every time he'd brought someone aboard to look at something. She said he had written about the valve cover gasket specifically. 3 years before he died, he'd noted that it was weeping and that he'd ordered a replacement but hadn't got to it yet. He was going to get to it in the spring. He didn't make it to that spring. She said he would have known that was the problem. Anyone who really knew his boat would have known. I said that was probably true. She said everyone else looked at it and saw a boat that couldn't be saved. You looked at it and saw his boat. I didn't say anything to that because there wasn't much to say, and sometimes the right response to something true is just to let it be true. She asked me how much it would cost to do the work. I told her. The number was significant. Not $1 million. This isn't that kind of story, or not quite, but it was a number that represented a real thing, a genuine commitment, not a casual decision. She said she wanted to do it. She said she wanted the boat operational by summer, because her father had a slip reserved at a marina in Mahone Bay, where he'd planned to take it that summer, and she wanted to take it there herself. I told her I could do that. We shook hands on the dock in the October gray, and it was one of those handshakes that is really an agreement about something more than it says on the surface, and I think we both knew it. But here's the part I haven't got to yet, and it's the part I keep coming back to. On my way out, walking back down the dock toward the gate, I stopped. There was something I hadn't mentioned in my assessment, something small, something that wasn't part of the structural condition of the boat, that I hadn't brought up because it felt peripheral, except it had been bothering me since I'd found it, not in a problem way, in a quiet way, the way a small thing will settle in your chest and stay there. When I'd been under the forward berth, flashlight in my teeth, looking at the hull planking, I'd seen something tucked into the corner of the berth shelf that the surveyors had either not noticed or not mentioned. It was a small brass cleat, a miniature one, the kind they used to make as keepsakes, as model boat hardware, 1.5 inches long, attached to a short length of braided dock line, tied into a simple bowline. It was the kind of knot a sailor ties without thinking. The kind a father ties while he's teaching his daughter to tie them. It was old. The brass had gone the color of old honey, and the dock line was sun-bleached and stiff, and someone had worn the knot smooth with handling over a long time. I turned around and went back down the dock. Simone was still standing in the cockpit looking out at the water. I said, "I found something in the forward berth. I should have mentioned it before. Can I show you?" She looked at me. I said, "It's on the shelf port side tucked into the corner. Small brass cleat on a piece of dock line, old bowline knot." And something happened to her face. It happened the way a shift in weather happens. Not in one moment, but in a series of small moments that suddenly become one moment, and all at once the sky is different. She stepped down into the cabin without saying anything, and I stood on the dock and waited, and after about 2 minutes she came back out. She had the cleat in her hand. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "He taught me to tie a bowline when I was 5. He said it was the one knot you could always trust. He said if you learned one knot, learn that one." She stopped. I forgot that this was here. I forgot entirely. I haven't been on this boat in 11 years. She turned the cleat over in her hand, and I could see that the knot had been tied by a large hand, deliberately, on a small piece of line, for someone small enough that the scale of it would seem just right. I let her have the moment. I've learned, in the course of doing this work, that sometimes objects hold things that words can't get close to, and the right thing is to stay quiet and let the object say what it needs to say. After a while she looked up at me and said, "You could have left this here. The salvage company would have come on Wednesday and no one would have known." I said I knew that. She said, "Why did you come back?" I said, "Because it wasn't mine to leave." I said I figured she'd want to know it was there. I said some things aren't really about the boat. She looked at me for a moment in that gray October light and said something I've thought about a lot since then. She said, "My father's notes from the last time he was on this boat, he wrote one line about it. Just one. He wrote, 'Took the cleat knot out and reedied it. Still holds.'" She put the cleat in the pocket of her canvas jacket. He was talking about more than the knot. I drove back to Lunenburg that afternoon with the particular quiet that comes after something you can't quite explain. Molly was at the kitchen table at Sandra's when I got back, coloring something with enormous concentration. She looked up and assessed me the way kids do when they know something happened. She said, "Did you fix the boat?" I said I was going to. She said, "Was it bad?" I said it wasn't as bad as people thought. She went back to coloring. Then she said, "Without looking up, you're in a thinking mood." I said I was. She said, "That's okay. I can talk enough for both of us." She can. She always has been able to. I don't know where she got it from, and I am grateful for it every single day. The commander came into my shop in November. I cleared space for her, which was an operation in itself, and Adrian and I spent the first week just going through her systematically, documenting everything, planning the sequence. Good restoration work is mostly planning. Most people don't know that. They think it's about skill with your hands, and that's part of it, but the real work is in understanding the order of things. What has to happen before what else can happen, and why, and what you're risking if you get it wrong. I pulled the valve cover, cleared the hydrolocked cylinder, checked the bearings. The engine came over on the 3rd attempt. I stood in my shop at 7 in the morning with coffee going cold on the workbench, and I listened to a 1971 Chris Craft Commander's engine run for the first time in what was probably a decade, and it sounded like something getting its breath back. I called Simone. It was 7:15 in the morning and I wasn't sure she'd be awake, but she answered on the second ring. I held the phone out so she could hear it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know that sound." I believed her. The work took most of the winter. It was the most complex single restoration I'd done, not in terms of the skills it required, but in terms of what it meant to get it right. I knew what the boat was. I knew who had owned it and why it mattered and what was at stake if I let it be anything less than what it could be. That kind of knowing either makes you nervous or it focuses you. For me, it focuses me. Molly came to the shop most days after school, did her homework at the corner desk I'd set up for her, asked questions, handed me things I needed without being asked, because she's been watching me work her whole life, and she knows the rhythm of it. In February, she started calling the boat the Callister boat, with a proprietary familiarity that made me laugh. She took a personal interest in the paint color decision, which I had not asked for but which I got anyway. In April, on a Thursday, I called Simone and told her the boat was done. She came to Lunenburg on a Saturday. She brought no one with her. She walked into my shop in her canvas jacket and her rubber boots, and she stood in front of the commander, and she was very still for a long time. I had stripped her back to bare wood, where I needed to, and refinished her with 7 coats of spar varnish, hand-rubbed between coats. The mahogany came up the color of dark honey in sunlight. The bright work was rebuilt and polished. The hull was painted the same deep navy she'd been when Howard Callister had bought her in 1994. I'd found the paint code in his records, which Simone had brought me along with everything else. The engine was clean and tuned and running true. I had replaced what needed replacing and kept what could be kept, because that's the work. You don't replace things you can restore, because the original things are the point. Simone walked around her slowly, the way you walk around something when you're trying to take all of it in at once and you can't, so you take it in sections. She ran her hand along the cabin side. She looked at the transom where I'd re-lettered the name, Commander, in gold leaf, the same font as the original, which I'd matched from a photograph in Howard's records. Then she opened the forward berth and looked at the port shelf. The brass cleat was there. She'd brought it back when she dropped off the records, tucked in an envelope with a note that said, "For the shelf, please, if you don't mind." I'd set it back in its corner. The bowline knot still held. She stood there looking at it for a moment. Then she turned around and looked at me and said she wanted to pay me something more than the quoted price. She named a number. It was more than I would have asked for. Significantly more. I told her the quoted price was the right price. I told her the work was worth what it was worth, and I didn't need more than that. She said, "You came back for the Cleat." I said that wasn't a thing you charged for. She said, "My father's note said you could trust you. That card he kept in the hull from 2019. He wrote next to your number, reliable, knows wood, decent man, he wrote that." I didn't know what to say to that. I'm not sure there's a right thing. She accepted the quoted price eventually, and we got the boat to Mahone Bay before the long weekend in May, and on a Saturday morning with a northwest breeze and that particular quality of Nova Scotia, spring light that makes everything look like it's been varnished, which I noticed with some professional satisfaction. Simone Callister took her father's Commander out of the marina and turned it south toward open water. She went alone. I wouldn't have expected otherwise. I stood on the dock with Molly, who had insisted on coming because she felt personally invested in the outcome after 4 months of homework at the corner desk, and we watched the Commander move out through the harbor mouth, the sun on her hull, her wake the only disturbance on the water. Molly said, "She looks happy." I said I thought so. Molly said, "Is that because you fixed it?" I thought about it. I said, "Partly. Mostly because of something her dad did a long time ago." Molly considered this with a serious face she makes when she's deciding whether to ask a follow-up question or let something sit. She let it sit, for once. She slipped her hand into mine and we stood on the dock and watched until the Commander was small against the horizon. There's a sound a wooden boat makes when it's running right. A particular note in the engine, a way the hull talks to the water. And it's different for every boat because every wooden boat is different, built by different hands at a different time with its own particular geometry. Howard Callister knew that sound for this boat the way you know the sound of someone you love moving through a house. The creak of a particular stair, the specific quiet of a particular room. I think about what Simone said when she heard the engine over the phone. I know that sound. Not it sounds good, or that's a relief. I know that sound, because the sound of a boat running is also the sound of the person who owned it, and the person who took you out in it on August mornings with hot chocolate in a thermos, and the sound of a bowline knot still holding. I've kept the card from Howard Callister's hull. It's on the edge of my workbench, the corner worn down to bare cardboard. Molly found it there one afternoon and picked it up and looked at it and put it back exactly where it was, without asking, because she understood without being told that it was there on purpose. Some things are worth keeping in the right place. That's what I know, after all of this. The reliable things, the decent things, the things somebody's father took care of once. They don't stop meaning what they mean just because he's gone. They keep meaning it. You just have to be the person who recognizes it.